The hypogeum of Halsaflieni, 12 meters below the streets of a modern Maltese town, carved entirely by hand into living limestone, there is a room that does something to the inside of your skull. Step inside, stand still, and let someone speak in a normal voice. Nothing theatrical, just one word. The sound doesn't echo. It doesn't fade the way sound fades in an empty room. It blooms. It comes from every wall at once, wraps itself around the back of your head, and then settles somewhere deep in your chest. You are not hearing the voice through your ears anymore. You are feeling it through your sternum. Now ask yourself how the people who built this place using antler picks and stone chisels in total darkness 5,500 years ago knew exactly what they were doing. The hypogeum of Halsaflieni was discovered in 1902 when a construction worker in Paula broke through a ceiling while digging a cistern. The Maltese government sealed it immediately and brought in archaeologist Themistocles Zamet, who excavated the site between 1903 and 1911. What he found was 3 descending levels of chambers carved from coralline limestone, with an estimated 500,000 tons of rock removed by hand. The site opened to limited public access and now admits no more than 80 visitors per day because the moisture from human breath alone was measurably degrading the walls. In 1994, researchers Aaron Watson and David Keating from the University of Reading published acoustic measurements of the main chamber, known as the Holy of Holies. The dominant resonant frequency was 110 to 111 Hz, consistent across multiple measurements, consistent across chambers of different shapes and sizes, a single pitch humming through the entire complex as if the rock itself were tuned. That finding sat quietly in the academic literature until neuroscientist Dr. Ian Cook at UCLA published work showing that 110 Hz frequency demonstrably alters brain activity, shifting dominance away from the left prefrontal cortex, the rational, analytical, language processing center of the brain, and toward the right hemisphere, the region governing emotion, spatial processing, and what clinical studies describe as trance-adjacent states. The Holy of Holies is not the only strange room. The oracle room is a small side chamber off the main corridor, and it does something even more specific. A male baritone voice spoken inside it resonates through the entire complex. A woman's voice does not. A child's voice does not. Only low male vocal tones in a narrow frequency range trigger the full effect. This is not architecture by accident. Accidental acoustics do not discriminate by gender and pitch. This was built to specifications. Approximately 7,000 skeletal remains were recovered from the lower ossuary levels, individuals deposited across centuries. The mainstream interpretation classifies the hypogeum as a subterranean funerary sanctuary of the Maltese temple period, the same religious culture that built the above-ground megalithic temples at Gantija and Menajdra. The acoustic properties are attributed to the natural resonance of dome-shaped spaces, which are inherently good at amplifying sound. The oracle room's gender specificity is attributed to coincidence of dimension. It's a coherent explanation, and the funerary function is supported directly by the physical evidence. But dome-shaped spaces resonate at frequencies determined by their specific dimensions. Two domes of different sizes produce different frequencies. The hypogeum's chambers are not the same size, they are not the same shape. For all of them to produce the same dominant resonant frequency, something about the geometry of each room was deliberately calibrated to converge on that single pitch. And the instruments required to measure acoustic frequency with that precision, the instruments a modern acoustic engineer would use as a matter of course, did not exist in 3600 BCE. Not anywhere on Earth. Some researchers have begun to ask a question that the funerary explanation doesn't address. What exactly was the intended experience for the people brought into these chambers? The 7,000 individuals interred here were not all buried simultaneously. This site was used repeatedly across centuries as a destination. People came here on purpose, in the dark, into a room that suppressed their rational mind and activated their emotional processing, guided by a priest whose bass voice resonated through the entire complex like a signal from the rock itself. Was this a burial rite? A healing practice? Something we don't have a category for? The hypogeum was sealed by soil accumulation around 2500 BCE and remained unknown for 4,400 years. Whatever the priests who built it were doing in the dark, they apparently decided the world wasn't ready to know. From an underground chamber in the Mediterranean that rewires the human brain, we crossed the Atlantic to a pyramid that hid something equally impossible beneath its floor, something that had no business being there, something that the first archaeologist to find it quietly made disappear. Teotihuacan's mica layer. In 1906, a Mexican government archaeologist named Leopoldo Batres was excavating beneath the floor of the Pyramid of the Sun, the third largest pyramid on Earth, at the ancient city of Teotihuacan, 50 kilometers northeast of what is now Mexico City. He was looking for tombs, for burial offerings, for the kind of evidence that tells you who built a place and why. What he found instead was a layer of mineral sheets. Flat, perfectly cut, slightly translucent, covering the entire base of the structure in two parallel layers. He recognized it immediately. It was mica. Hundreds of tons of it. He removed it all. He did not mention it in his official excavation report, and for 60 years no one asked why. Teotihuacan was, in the 1st century of the Common Era, the largest city in the Western Hemisphere, with a population estimated at 125,000 people, larger than Rome at the same period. The Pyramid of the Sun has a base of 225 by 222 meters and a volume of 1.18 million cubic meters, comparable in footprint to the Great Pyramid of Giza. Someone built this city with a level of urban planning sophistication that still draws architectural scholars from around the world. And somewhere in the process, someone made the decision to bury hundreds of tons of a very specific mineral where no one would ever see it, with no record of why. A second mica deposit was rediscovered in the 1980s during a separate excavation at a structure now called the Mica Temple. Two parallel layers of mica sheets, each layer approximately 90 square meters in area, the sheets cut to near uniform thickness and laid in overlapping tile patterns beneath the floor. This deposit was left in place. Mineralogical analysis of the Teotihuacan mica confirmed its origin as the state of Minas Gerais in Brazil, approximately 4,600 kilometers away. There is no natural mica deposit anywhere in Mesoamerica. The nearest significant source is in Brazil, and the nearest secondary source is in the northeastern United States. Someone transported hundreds of tons of a non-local mineral across 4,600 kilometers of jungle, mountain, and ocean, and then buried it under a floor. Here is what makes this genuinely difficult to explain away. Mica has no recorded ceremonial or religious significance in any Mesoamerican culture. None. In every other context where Teotihuacan's builders used a prestige material, that material is visible. Jade, obsidian, decorated ceramics, they appear in tombs, on altars, in offering contexts. They are displayed. Mica appears exclusively beneath foundations and floors, invisible to everyone, including the rulers who commissioned its placement. If it was a status symbol or a religious offering, it was the only one in Mesoamerican history specifically designed so that no living person would ever see it. That is not how symbolism works. That is how insulation works. Mica's primary applications in modern industry are as an electrical insulator, a thermal barrier, and a material used in capacitors for its dielectric properties. It is used in nuclear facilities as a neutron reflector. It is found inside almost every electronic device you own. The specific property that makes mica useful in all of these contexts is its ability to manage the behavior of electromagnetic energy. In 2015, archaeologist Sergio Gomez Chavez discovered large pools of liquid mercury beneath the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent at Teotihuacan, another material with unique electromagnetic properties and no obvious ceremonial explanation. The city street grid is oriented 15.5 degrees east of true north, an orientation that does not align with any obvious astronomical body by the simplest calculation. The mainstream interpretation is that the mica was a prestige trade item imported through long-distance exchange networks that did connect Mesoamerica to South America through coastal routes over centuries. Its placement beneath floors may have been a dedicatory act, an offering to the earth, consistent with other ritual burial practices at the site. This is a legitimate reading of the evidence, and dedicatory caching is well documented in Mesoamerican archaeology. But prestige items brought 4,600 kilometers through jungle on the strength of religious significance are displayed. They are not buried in industrial quantities under an engineering structure and then omitted from the excavation report. And the first archaeologist who found it removed every piece without documentation. That decision alone is worth sitting with. What did Batri see in that mica layer that made him decide the world shouldn't know about it? The Yonaguni Monument. You drop beneath the surface 25 meters off the coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost point of Japan, and the seafloor changes. The reef gives way to something else, something flat, something angular. You kick closer and run your hand along an edge so sharp and so straight it takes you a moment to process what you're touching. It is a step. A perfectly even step, 1 meter of rise, 1 meter of tread, cut as cleanly as if someone ran a blade through the rock. Above it, another step exactly the same. You look along the face of the formation and the steps continue for 50 meters, uniform and deliberate, rising in a series of terraced platforms toward a summit 27 meters above the seafloor. You are looking at something that has been at this depth for at least 10,000 years. Whatever built it was already ancient when the ocean arrived to cover it. Local dive instructor Kihachiro Aratake discovered the Yonaguni Monument in 1986 while surveying for hammerhead shark dive sites. Photographs published in 1987 immediately ignited a debate that has never been resolved. University of the Ryukyus marine geologist Masaki Kimura began systematic study in 1990 and spent 15 years diving the monument, eventually cataloging at least 8 distinct structural features in peer-reviewed publications: terraced platforms, a wide road-like formation, a triangular pool feature, apparent carved pillar stumps, and a formation in profile that resembles a human face carved into the rock. Kimura argued consistently for artificial origin. Boston University geologist Robert Schoch, who has also dived the site, argued in 2004 that the formation is a natural sandstone terrace, possibly modified by human activity, but primarily geological in origin. Here is the fact that neither argument can avoid. Sea level analysis confirms that the Yonaguni Shelf was above water from approximately 20,000 to 10,000 BCE during the final phases of the last ice age. The water arrived 10,000 years ago and has not retreated since. If a single human hand shaped a single surface of the Yonaguni Monument, that hand belongs to 10,000 BCE at the absolute latest. That date predates the earliest known civilization on Earth, Göbekli Tepe itself, by 400 years. It predates Mesopotamia by 6,000 years. It predates the Egyptian Old Kingdom by 7,000 years. The terraces display consistent step heights of 1 meter plus or minus 5 centimeters across a 50-meter horizontal span. Natural sandstone does fracture in geometric patterns along joint planes, producing flat surfaces and right angles. This is the core of Schoch's argument, and it is geologically sound. But the statistical uniformity of the Yonaguni steps, 1 meter of height maintained within a 5-centimeter variance across 50 meters, is not consistent with natural joint spacing, which is random by definition. Random fracturing does not produce uniform steps, it produces irregular blocks. And Kimura's team documented what they identified as cross-chisel tool marks on several surfaces, marks that do not occur in natural sandstone fracturing and that require a tool moving against the rock in a controlled, repetitive motion. Schoch's own position that the monument is partially modified by human activity is perhaps the most honest reading of the available evidence, and it may also be the most explosive, because partially modified by human hands at this depth means human hands in 10,000 BCE. It means a people sophisticated enough to work stone, to recognize a natural formation and reshape it with intention, were doing so at a time when mainstream archaeology says the most complex human behavior was chipping flint beside a fire. The local Yonaguni oral tradition references a sunken city. Japanese ethnographers documented this tradition in the early 20th century, decades before Arataki's dive. No systematic underwater excavation of the sediment surrounding the monument has been conducted to search for artifacts or organic material that could be carbon dated. The formation sits in one of the most seismically active ocean regions in the world, with challenging currents that make extended excavation difficult. What we have is the structure itself, its geometry, its age, and the discomfort of a debate that both sides have quietly agreed not to fully resolve. If it's natural, the geometry needs explaining. If it's man-made, the timeline needs rewriting. Neither option is comfortable. Both options are on the table. From Japan's underwater threshold, we move across the Pacific to a city built on open water with stone that the people who built it said simply floated there. And the geophysical measurements suggest that something about the stone is, in fact, unusual. Nan Madol. You are standing at the edge of a tidal flat on a remote Micronesian island and looking at a city built on nothing, not on land, on a lagoon. 92 artificial islands, each one a platform of stacked stone columns interlocked without mortar, like a massive game of geometric architecture rising from the water on a foundation of coral rubble and mangrove. The walls of the largest enclosure reach 7.5 meters in height. They are built from prismatic basalt columns, each one somewhere between 5 and 50 tons, stacked in a log cabin pattern with a precision that has survived 800 years of tropical storms and tidal erosion. There is no quarry on this island that matches the stone. The Pohnpeian oral tradition is consistent and specific about how it got here. A sorcerer named Isokelekul flew it across the ocean. When geophysicists arrived and measured the basalt, they found something they did not expect. The stone is magnetized in a way that the standard geological explanation for aged basalt doesn't quite account for. Nan Madol sits in Pohnpei, Micronesia, 2,500 kilometers east of the Philippines, and it is the only ancient city on Earth built entirely on open water with no land base. Ethnographer William Bascom documented it in the 1940s. Rufino Mauricio led detailed surveys for the Federated States of Micronesia in the 1980s and 90s. UNESCO inscribed the site in 2016. The total estimated mass of transported basalt is 750,000 tons. Carbon dating of organic material within the construction layers by Mauricio's team returned dates as early as 200 BCE for preliminary activity, suggesting the site's history extends perhaps 600 to 800 years before its major monumental phase. The transport problem is where the mainstream explanation struggles. The hexagonal and columnar basalt logs used in the walls were quarried from at least 2 sites on Pohnpei and 1 on a neighboring island. Engineers who have studied the logistics calculated that moving a single 50-ton basalt column by raft across the open water passages between the quarry sites and Nan Madol would require a raft of dimensions that would be functionally unnavigable in any sea state greater than flat calm. Flat calm conditions in Micronesia occur on approximately 30 days per year, 750,000 tons of basalt, 30 workable days per year if everything went perfectly. The math does not close, and no one has seriously attempted to make it close. The magnetic anomaly adds a different dimension entirely. Geophysical surveys conducted in the 1990s detected magnetic field irregularities concentrated beneath certain islets, particularly beneath the Nandawa's tomb enclosure, the most sacred space in the complex. Basalt retains a magnetic signature from the moment it cools from volcanic rock, and that signature is oriented to the magnetic field of the Earth at the time of cooling. After centuries of exposure, transport, and mechanical disturbance during construction, that residual magnetism should be weakened, randomized, and generally consistent with ambient background field. The anomalies measured beneath Nandawas were neither weakened nor consistent with the ambient field. Something about that specific location, that specific arrangement of stone, was producing a coherently oriented magnetic reading that the standard geological explanation does not fully account for. Archaeologists explain Nan Madol as the political and ceremonial capital of the Sodelur dynasty, whose centralized authority over Pohnpei allowed it to mobilize labor on a scale otherwise impossible for an island society. The basalt transport is attributed to organized flotilla operations during calm seasons using multiple smaller craft lashed together. The magnetic readings are attributed to natural remnant magnetism of the basalt itself. These are reasonable positions, and the Sodelur dynasty's historical existence is well documented in Pohnpeian oral tradition across 30 or more generations. But the Pohnpeian oral tradition does not say the stone was carried, it says it flew. It says Isokalekal and his brother used magic to levitate the basalt columns across the water. Oral traditions are not engineering manuals, and nobody is suggesting the stone literally flew. But oral traditions also do not preserve claims of supernatural transportation for 800 years unless something about the transport was so extraordinary that no ordinary description seemed adequate. At what point does the impossibility of the conventional explanation make the unconventional one worth taking more seriously? Derinkuyu. In 1963, a man in central Turkey is renovating his home and knocks down a wall to expand a room. Behind it is another room. Behind that room is a corridor. The corridor leads to a shaft. He gets a torch and follows the shaft down, and down, and down. He is 8 stories below street level before the complex opens into something he has no framework for. A city. A complete self-contained city for 20,000 people, with stables for livestock, wine cellars, water wells, kitchens, schools, chapels, and armories. The ventilation system still works. The wells still reach water. And on the ceiling of every single chamber, in a complex that housed 20,000 human beings and all of their animals, there is not one trace of soot. Nobody in this city ever lit a fire. Derinkuyu is in Nevşehir Province, Cappadocia, in central Turkey, 40 meters below a modern town of the same name. The Turkish Department of Culture began formal excavation and mapping in 1963, the same year of its accidental rediscovery. The site opened to limited public access in 1969. As of the most recent mapping, 18 levels have been identified, with the deepest confirmed level at approximately 85 meters below the surface. Roughly half the complex remains unexplored. The engineering specifications are staggering even by modern standards. 600 ventilation shafts have been documented, each one calculated to deliver fresh air to every occupied level simultaneously from a single opening at the surface down through all 18 floors. The deepest shaft reaches 85 meters. Maintaining adequate oxygen pressure across that vertical span for a population of 20,000 is a ventilation problem that a modern HVAC engineer would solve with electric fans, sensors, and computational fluid dynamics modeling. The builders of Derinkuyu solved it with geometry and patience, and they got it right on the first try, because there was no room for error at 85 meters underground. The rolling stone doors that sealed each tunnel section are circular, carved from a single block of volcanic tuff, 1 to 1.5 meters in diameter, and operable only from the interior. An invading force that breached the entrance would face a sealed door that could not be opened from the outside at every level for all 18 floors. A tunnel at the 7th level connects Derinkuyu to a neighboring underground city, Kaymakli, 9 kilometers away, creating a subterranean network beneath the Cappadocian Plateau that extends, in fragments, across at least 200 identified sites. The mainstream archaeological explanation attributes Derinkuyu to successive waves of inhabitants. Hittites or Phrygians initially for storage and seasonal refuge, then early Christians fleeing Roman and later Arab persecution between the 7th and 12th centuries of the Common Era. Byzantine communities are historically documented as using the complex during Arab raids. The ventilation engineering and the water supply reflect sophisticated practical knowledge accumulated by experienced stone carvers working in volcanic tuff, a material that is soft when first cut and hardens on exposure to air, making it manageable with basic tools. This is all historically plausible and partially verified, but the scale and permanence of Derinkuyu exceeds any threat that Byzantine Christians hiding from medieval cavalry needed to address. A community can hide from a raiding force in a shallow cave. You do not construct 18 floors of subterranean city with 85-meter ventilation shafts to evade horses. The engineering is generational, requiring multiple lifetimes of organized labor, which means whoever commissioned it was planning for a threat so sustained and so total that it required a permanent underground civilization, not a temporary refuge. And that decision predates the Christian occupation of the space by an unknown number of centuries. Geologist Axel Schmidt at the University of California published work on the dating of volcanic eruptions in Cappadocia, with the last major eruption of nearby Hassan Dal estimated at approximately 6,600 BCE. A civilization that witnessed a Cappadocian supervolcanic event, or that inherited the memory of one, would find an underground city not paranoid but rational. The soft tuff left by that eruption was the very material in which Derinkuyu was carved. The builders did not just survive in the rock. They may have survived because of it, carving a permanent answer to the surface world's most fundamental vulnerability: the sky. In Vilcabamba, the sky is not a threat. It is part of the answer. But nobody knows which part or why the answer only works in one specific valley on Earth. Vilcabamba. In 1971, an Ecuadorian physician named Miguel Salvador sits across a table from a farmer named Miguel Carpio. Carpio is lean, sun-weathered, and alert. He has no formal education and has never been outside his valley. He also claims to be 123 years old. Salvador is skeptical. He has heard these claims before in the Vilcabamba Valley. He asked to see the church birth records. The records say 1848. It is 1971. Miguel Carpio was born in 1848, and he is not the oldest person in the room's village. He is not even close. The valley has others. Vilcabamba is in Loja province in southern Ecuador, a narrow highland valley at 1,500 meters elevation in the Andean foothills, population approximately 5,000. It was first brought to international scientific attention by Ecuadorian physician Guillermo Vela in a 1955 survey that documented an anomalous cluster of verified centenarians in the local population. American physician Alexander Leaf profiled the valley in a landmark 1973 National Geographic article comparing it to two other supposed longevity zones in Soviet Georgia and Pakistani Hunza. The global rate of verified centenarians at the time of Leaf's study was approximately 17 per 100,000 people. In Vilcabamba, even the most conservative estimates place the rate at more than 10 times that figure. Researchers Dr. Richard Mazes and Dr. Sylvia Foreman from the University of Wisconsin published a 1979 correction in the journal Human Biology, finding evidence that some Vilcabambans overstated their ages, a cultural practice of venerating elderhood that inflated certain claims. Their correction was significant. It reduced the most extreme age claims by years, but it did not eliminate the anomaly. Even after correction, Vilcabamba's rate of validated extreme longevity remained statistically far outside the global norm. The denominator changed. The mystery did not. Water analysis conducted by Ecuadorian government scientists found that the Vilcabamba river water contains unusually high concentrations of colloidal minerals, including lithium, magnesium, iron, and calcium in ratios not found in adjacent watersheds drawing from the same mountain range. The valley's soil volcanic mineral content runs 4 to 5 times higher than comparable Andean valleys nearby. A 1981 study at the University of Loja found that plants grown in Vilcabamba soil showed measurably accelerated growth rates and reduced oxidative stress markers compared to the same species grown in adjacent valley soil. Geomagnetic measurements taken in the late 1990s found the valley sits within a weak but detectable anomaly, a slight reduction in local magnetic field intensity relative to the surrounding terrain. The mainstream scientific position, following Mazes and Foreman, holds that Vilcabamba's longevity is a combination of documented age exaggeration, low-calorie traditional diet, high daily physical activity, minimal chronic stress, and favorable environmental conditions. It is a sensible and evidence-supported explanation. Diet, exercise, and low stress are the backbone of every longevity study conducted anywhere in the world. But those same lifestyle factors exist throughout the Andes. Low-calorie diets of leafy vegetables, legumes, and whole grains are common across dozens of highland communities within a 100-kilometer radius of Vilcabamba. High daily physical activity is universal in subsistence farming communities from Ecuador to Bolivia. Minimal chronic stress and strong social cohesion are not unique to this valley. And yet no comparable longevity cluster exists in any neighboring community with identical habits, identical altitude, and comparable social structure. The lifestyle explanation requires that something about this specific valley produces a different biological outcome than the same lifestyle produces 30 kilometers away. And when researchers ask what that something is, the answer keeps coming back to the water, the soil, and a geomagnetic signature that the surrounding terrain does not share. The Inca considered certain geographic locations to carry what they called huaca, a living sacred power embedded in the landscape itself. Vilcabamba has been continuously inhabited since long before the Inca arrived. Whatever the Inca recognized as huaca in this valley, modern biochemistry may be measuring without fully understanding. The valley is not a placebo, it is a place, and something in the specific combination of its mineral, magnetic, and hydrological conditions appears to produce a measurably different biological environment than the world outside it. We have been studying Vilcabamba for 70 years. We still cannot explain it in terms that make the anomaly go away. The Plain of Jars. You are walking across a highland plateau in northeastern Laos, and the ground around you is littered with enormous stone containers. Not pottery, stone. Each one is a single block, hollowed to a depth of 1 to 3 meters. The largest one stands before you now, and you walk around it slowly. It weighs 14 tons, cut and hollowed from a single piece of rock, its interior walls smooth in a way that implies sustained rotational abrasion, a technique that has no documented analog in the Bronze Age material culture of Southeast Asia. There are 2,100 of them on this plateau, scattered across an area of 90 square kilometers. The quarry sites are up to 8 kilometers away. No tools have been found at the quarries. No transport infrastructure has been found on the routes between the quarries and the sites. The jars themselves leave no evidence of how they were made or how they got here. They are simply present, as if they always were. The Plain of Jars was first formally documented by French archaeologist Madeleine Colani, whose 2-volume 1935 study Mégalithes du Haut-Laos remains the foundational text on the subject. Colani identified 3 major sites. Subsequent surveys by the Lao government and international teams expanded that count to 781 confirmed jar sites across the Sheng Kuang Plateau as of 2020. Australian National University archaeologist Louise Shepherd led a major modern excavation and dating project from 2016 to 2020, producing the most detailed chronological analysis of the site to date. Shepherd's radiocarbon dating placed the construction and primary use period at approximately 500 BCE to 500 CE, with some carbon-dated organic material from Site 1 suggesting initial activity as early as 1200 BCE. The jars range from 1 to 3 meters in height and 1 to 3 meters in diameter. Kalani identified 4 distinct rock types in the assemblage: sandstone, granite, limestone, and conglomerate. The conglomerate jars have no confirmed quarry source within the plateau region. They exist. Their raw material does not appear to exist anywhere nearby. Excavations at multiple sites by the ANU team confirmed what Kolani had originally proposed. The jars were used for secondary burial. Bodies or cremated remains were deposited inside or adjacent to the jars, and burial goods including glass beads, iron tools, and ceramic fragments were recovered from the surrounding soil. This function is now well established. What is not established is anything about the process by which 2,100 stone vessels, weighing up to 14 tons each, were extracted from quarries, hollowed with interior walls polished to a uniform smoothness, and transported across 8 kilometers of mountainous terrain, all without leaving a single chisel, a single sled groove, a single evidence of the mechanism behind the work. The standard archaeological explanation draws a parallel to other megalithic cultures worldwide. When communities are sufficiently organized and motivated, they can achieve extraordinary physical feats using basic tools over extended time periods. The Stonehenge bluestones were moved 200 kilometers from Wales. The Inca moved 200-ton limestone blocks at Sacsayhuaman. Human ingenuity applied with sufficient labor and time is capable of things that appear impossible in retrospect. This is true, and it applies here. But every other documented megalithic culture has left traces of the process. The quarry infrastructure at Stonehenge, the tool assemblages at Sacsayhuaman, the ramp construction evidence at Giza. The plain of jars has left 781 finished objects and zero evidence of the process that produced any one of them across 781 separate sites on the same plateau. That is not what the archaeological record of a megalithic culture looks like. Kalani herself, in her 1935 publication, raised the question of whether the jars predated the culture that used them for burial, and whether the burial practice was a secondary repurposing of objects whose original function was already lost to time. That hypothesis has not been disproven in 90 years. Nobody has seriously tried to disprove it. The jars stand on the plateau, smooth and silent, and the question of who made them and what for remains exactly as open as the day Kalani first asked it. The Riche structure. In 360 BCE, the philosopher Plato wrote a description of a lost civilization. He said it existed on a large island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, which is the Strait of Gibraltar. He said its capital city was built on a hill and surrounded by concentric alternating rings of land and water linked by canals. He gave specific measurements, ring widths of 1, 2, and 3 stadia, respectively, totaling an outer diameter of approximately 23 kilometers. He said the civilization was destroyed in a single catastrophic event and sank beneath the sea. He named the story Atlantis. For 2,400 years, scholars have debated whether Plato was recording history or writing allegory. Most have settled on allegory. Then someone looked at a satellite photograph of the Sahara and noticed the rings. The Riche structure is located in the Sahara Desert, Mauritania, West Africa, 500 kilometers inland from the Atlantic coast. It is visible from orbit as a 50-kilometer-wide series of concentric rings, so geometrically precise that Gemini astronauts in the 1960s first reported it as a potential meteor impact crater. Geological analysis subsequently revealed it to be a deeply eroded symmetrical anticline, a dome of rock pushed upward by ancient magmatic intrusion and worn down by millions of years of erosion. NASA satellite imaging confirms the structure's rings as among the most geometrically regular concentric formations on Earth. The standard classification is geological curiosity. Until recently, very few researchers pushed beyond that classification to ask whether the structure's geometry deserved more careful attention against the only ancient text that describes a concentric ringed civilization in this general region. Researcher Randall Carlson and others who have applied Plato's measurements to the Riche structure's inner ring dimensions have found correspondences that are difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. Plato's description of alternating land and water rings in specific proportional widths when applied to the Riche's eroded but still measurable ring system falls within a 10 to 15% margin of correspondence. The structure also sits at roughly the correct latitude relative to the Atlas Mountains, which Plato names as a geographic landmark adjacent to Atlantis. The region was a shallow sea during the Cretaceous period, consistent with coastal geography in a much earlier epoch. Freshwater springs and ancient paleo lake beds exist within the rings, consistent with Plato's description of internal water channels. The concentric rock bands of the structure itself are composed of visually distinct stone types appearing in alternating dark and light layers, which corresponds to Plato's specific mention that the rings of the city were built from black, white, and red stone. The mainstream scholarly position is that the dimensional resemblance is within the margin of variance one would expect from comparing any large circular natural formation to a non-specific ancient unit of measurement, and that Plato's Atlantis is a philosophical allegory illustrating political hubris, not a geographic record. Classical scholars have noted that Plato's account in Critias contains elements typical of mythological construction, and that no contemporary Greek source corroborates it. These are serious objections, and they carry weight. But the coincidences are stacking in a specific direction. It's not just the ring structure, it's not just the diameter, it's the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules, it's the Atlas Mountain adjacency, it's the alternating rock colors, it's the fresh water inside the rings, it's the specific date Plato gives for the disaster, 9600 BCE, which corresponds precisely to the period of rapid sea level rise and catastrophic coastal flooding that followed the end of the last ice age. Any one of these correspondences could be dismissed. All of them simultaneously requires a different kind of explanation. Acheulean and Tyrian stone tools dated to 15,000 years ago and beyond have been recovered from within the Risha structure, confirming that this location was continuously occupied by humans across deep time. Nobody has conducted a systematic archaeological excavation of the inner rings searching for evidence of monumental construction beneath the current desert sediment. The structure is sitting in the Sahara, 50 kilometers wide, waiting for someone to take Plato's measurements seriously enough to dig. The Theater of Epidaurus. A guide strikes a match at the center of the stage. You are sitting in the highest row of the theater, 60 tiers above the orchestra floor, 60 meters from the stage, surrounded by 14,000 empty limestone seats. You hear the match strike. Not a faint version of it, not a ghost of it carried on the air. The match, clear, sharp, crisp, positioned exactly at the stage, as if the sound were traveling in a straight line from the guide's hand directly to your ear. There is no roof above you. There is no amplification system, no acoustic paneling, no baffles, no technology of any kind between you and the open sky. The theater has been operating this way for 2,370 years. In 2007, a pair of Belgian researchers finally figured out how it works. The answer, when it came, raised a question that the researchers themselves didn't fully address. How did anyone in 350 BCE know enough to build it this way on purpose? The Theater of Epidaurus was built in the northeastern Peloponnese region of Greece at the sanctuary of Asclepius, the ancient god of medicine and healing. It is attributed to architect Polykleitos the Younger and dated to approximately 350 BCE. It was excavated by Greek archaeologist Panagiotis Kavadias between 1881 and 1928, emerging from centuries of soil accumulation in extraordinary preservation. The ancient travel writer Pausanias described it in the 2nd century of the Common Era as most worthy of seeing, specifically for its beauty and its proportions. It seats 14,000 to 14,500 spectators across 55 rows of limestone seating. The lower 34 rows are original construction. The upper 21 rows were added in the 2nd century BCE and integrate seamlessly with the original acoustic profile. Nico de Klerk and Cindy de Keyser at Ghent University published their acoustic analysis in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America in 2007. Their measurement campaign confirmed what visitors had reported for 2 millennia: near-perfect acoustic clarity across all 14,000 seats, including the uppermost rows 60 meters from the stage. Background noise, wind noise, crowd murmur, the ambient acoustic environment of an outdoor hillside venue was measurably attenuated at the upper seating by approximately 10 decibels relative to an open-air control. That is not a marginal improvement. 10 decibels represents a halving of perceived loudness for ambient noise, enough to shift speech intelligibility from difficult to clear for every person in the highest tier. The mechanism de Klerk and de Keyser identified was the limestone seating itself. The corrugated surface of the seat rows acts as a high-pass acoustic filter, absorbing low-frequency background noise, specifically frequencies below approximately 500 Hz, while reflecting high-frequency sound, including the human voice, upward and outward with near-perfect clarity. This is a sophisticated acoustic engineering principle, selective frequency filtering through surface microstructure, that was not formally described in Western science until the 20th century. The mainstream explanation is that Greek architects understood through generations of empirical refinement what proportions produced good outdoor acoustics. The site selection is favorable, the bowl geometry is inherently good at directing sound, and the limestone's acoustic properties were discovered through practical experience accumulated across many theater constructions. Trial and error, carried forward through the architectural tradition, eventually produced Epidaurus. But Epidaurus is not the product of a tradition. It is the anomaly within the tradition. No other ancient Greek theater achieves the same acoustic clarity. Not the theater of Dionysus in Athens, not the theater at Delphi, not the magnificent theater at Aspendos in Turkey, which is better preserved than Epidaurus and built from similar materials with a similar bowl geometry. If the Epidaurus effect were the natural outcome of accumulated Greek theatrical knowledge, we would expect a progression of increasingly good theaters culminating in Epidaurus. Instead, Epidaurus stands alone, and nothing built afterward replicates it, including theaters built by architects who had Epidaurus as a standing model to copy. The theater was built at a healing sanctuary. Asclepius was the god of medicine. Patients traveled from across the ancient world to Epidaurus specifically to receive treatment, which included sleep incubation, lying in the sanctuary overnight to receive healing visions and diagnoses in dreams. Sound was documented as a therapeutic tool in ancient Greek medicine, with specific tonal frequencies associated with specific conditions. Polykleitos the Younger also designed the tholos at the same sanctuary, a circular structure of unknown function whose subterranean labyrinthine foundations remain unexplained by any utilitarian interpretation. There is a pattern here that nobody has fully connected. An architect associated with one structure of unknown acoustic function designed another structure of extraordinary acoustic precision at a site dedicated to the healing of the human body. The theater did not just provide entertainment. It may have been the treatment. The question is whether the architect who built it understood the neurological mechanism he was deploying the way the builders of the hypogeum apparently did, or whether he arrived at the same destination through a different road and left us the same unanswered question in stone. Look at these 10 places together, not one at a time, all 10 simultaneously. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who, by every metric we have, should not have been capable of building it. Then they buried it with an engineering precision specifically designed to preserve it through whatever they knew was coming. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni was carved to resonate at a specific frequency that suppresses rational thought and induces altered states, a frequency modern neuroscience only identified in the 20th century, and its oracle room was acoustically calibrated to respond to a specific human vocal range. Teotihuacan buried hundreds of tons of electrically insulating mica from Brazil beneath its largest pyramid, a material with no ceremonial function, and every industrial one, and the first archaeologist to find it quietly made it disappear. Yonaguni's step formations sit at a depth that places any human involvement at 10,000 BCE at the absolute latest, predating every known civilization by thousands of years. Nan Madol was constructed from 750,000 tons of magnetized stone transported across open Pacific Ocean by a society that left no engineering record of how, and the magnetic anomaly beneath its tomb enclosure still hasn't been adequately explained. Derinkuyu is an 18-floor underground city built for 20,000 people, engineered with a sophistication that exceeds what the attributed cultures should have possessed, in response to a threat so total that its builders designed for permanent underground civilization rather than temporary refuge. Vilcabamba produces longevity statistics that defeat every lifestyle explanation and every cross-cultural comparison, the anomaly centering specifically on the valley's unique mineral, hydrological, and geomagnetic profile. The Plain of Jars deposited 2,100 megalithic stone vessels across a Laotian plateau and left no trace of the process. The Risha structure matches Plato's geometric and geographic description of Atlantis with a specificity that accumulates well past the threshold of comfortable coincidence. And the theater of Epidaurus solved an acoustic engineering problem in 350 BCE that required peer-reviewed science in 2007 to explain, and that no subsequent architect has successfully replicated. The mainstream answer to each of these individually is practical ingenuity, coincidence, convergent evolution, or selective interpretation. These are real explanations. They are not invented to protect a narrative. Humans are remarkably capable, and the archaeological record is full of evidence of extraordinary achievement under primitive conditions. The standard model of human development is not a conspiracy. It is the accumulated work of thousands of researchers across 2 centuries of rigorous study. But the standard model has a recurring problem. It explains the form without accounting for the precision. It explains the outcome without tracing the mechanism. And in every one of these 10 cases, the precision exceeds what the known context allows by a margin that the available explanations cannot fully close. What you are looking at across these 10 locations, spanning 4 continents and 11,000 years of human history, may not be a series of isolated anomalies. It may be evidence of a tide. Knowledge advancing, reaching a peak, retreating in catastrophe, and then advancing again, with each subsequent civilization inheriting fragments of what came before and losing the rest. Each fragment precise enough to be built in stone, each fragment old enough that the context that made it legible has been lost. Most people encounter these places in a textbook paragraph or a museum display case and see a curiosity at best. They accept the standard explanation and move on. You stayed for the whole list. That means your mind doesn't stop at the official answer. It keeps asking what the official answer isn't accounting for. This channel exists for exactly that kind of mind. Hit subscribe and go to the comments. Pick one of these 10 locations and make the case. Which one, in your view, is the hardest to explain away? Build the argument. Defend it. Let's find out together where the evidence actually leads. These places do not age the way they should. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe look new after 11,000 years. The hypogeum still rings at the same pitch. The steps at Yonaguni have not crumbled. The valley in Ecuador still keeps its people longer than biology permits. Something has been threading its way through human history for 12,000 years, pressing itself into stone and soil and water wherever it passed, patient enough to wait for a civilization capable of asking the right questions. We keep calling it coincidence. The stone, as always, disagrees. If this video changed the way you see the ancient world, subscribe now. The archive goes deeper.